Hi, good morning, you all. Let me first say thank you for having me here. Thank you for hosting this incredible event together with the World Championships. Having it here in Antwerp, I'm a proud citizen of Antwerp, is just magnificent. Last time I was here in this exact building was in full COVID crisis when I had to get my shots. So let me just say this is much more pleasant to be here today. My name is Tine. Thank you for the perfect introduction. So let's just get started. I would like to bring you a little bit of the current stage of the knowledge that we have on harassment and abuse in sport, the challenges that you, but also all other international sport federations and national federations are facing in dealing with harassment and abuse in sport, and the ways forward that I think we can learn from. First of all, the problem of harassment and abuse. What does it mean to you? What kind of words do you use to describe all of these negative, unhealthy, unpleasant behaviors? It is problematic. What you think harassment and abuse is might be different to me and different to somebody else. Even translating the word interpersonal violence, harassment and abuse, in our language, grensoverschrijdend gedrag, boundary transgressive behavior. It's complicated. Terminology matters, but as long as there is no universal definition on what harassment and abuse is, it really complicates our conversation. And let me just be very clear, there will never be a universal definition of harassment and abuse because it's such a highly personal and subjective experience. What we can do is try to come to a consensus of what several components or experiences could be and what we as a sports family would like not to see in our sports organizations. That is why the IOC created a consensus statement on harassment and abuse, or what they then called non-accidental violence, very complicated and legal term. And they defined 4 different components of harassment and abuse in sport. First of all, psychological abuse, a pattern of deliberate, prolonged, repeated, non-contact and potentially harmful behaviors with a power differential relationship. Physical abuse, of course, all acts of physical violence, but specifically in sport, of course, also forms of inappropriate training that could lead to harm. Then, of course, sexual harassment and abuse, which is no different inside sport than outside sport, but of course we should also be very mindful that it can happen in our clubs and organizations. And then, often forgotten, neglect in sport, which is a form that we also see, and mainly in elite athletes. For example, not being allowed to drink during training or go to use the toilet, or having to train in heat without shadow or water. So these are forms that we see physical, psychological neglect, but also sometimes medical neglect, not receiving the proper care after an injury or an illness, or even, on a very high level, educational neglect, that you're forced to quit school to focus on your sports career. A couple of very specific forms, sometimes combination of both physical and psychological or sexual, are hazing, initiation rites, very common in some sport and in some regions of the world. Bullying, body shaming, also common. We find that as well in gymnastics. Cyberbullying, everything that happens online. There's interactions online that are healthy, and there's many interactions online that are not so healthy or have the potential to harm people. And all specific forms of child maltreatment. We're not saying that adult athletes cannot be harmed in sport, but children, of course, deserve our specific focus and attention due to their increased vulnerability. Now, the next question, of course, that every politician and policymaker asks is, okay, if we know what it is, then how big is the problem? And until a few years ago, we didn't have a clear answer because we were really lacking studies on the magnitude of harassment and abuse in sport, and maybe even specifically in gymnastics, the same problem arose. However, after the Me Too movement, we saw a big increase in academia, in researchers that were interested in the topic of harassment and abuse and tried to design methodologies to measure how big the problem was. Most of these studies come from Europe, as you can see, 24 out of 44 that are now peer-reviewed and published in scientific journals, and secondly, coming from mainly Canada in Northern America. We do see a couple of studies popping up in other countries, but in general, Global South, Africa, South America are not well represented in the data. Now, what is the result so far? If we look at how big the problem is, you don't have to be a statistician to see that there is a big problem in sports. Indeed, if we ask people, have you ever experienced harassment and abuse in your life as an athlete before the age of 18, that's the design that most studies use, then you see quite a big number of sport participants saying yes to at least one of those forms of harassment and abuse. In the first column, you see the number of athletes that said yes to at least one form. So it could be physical, could be psychological, could be neglect, could be a combination. And you see that in the minimal that we found in all of these studies is as high as 44%. That's the lowest number that we found in all these 44 studies. The highest number, as you can see, is almost like 80%. There's a big difference there. But it should be somewhere in between, if we look at the average. For psychological violence, you see this is the most common form, together with neglect. Again, big difference between the lowest number found in one study and the highest number found in another study. Same for physical and sexual violence, the low estimate there, the lowest estimate that we can find is rather low, luckily, but still, having a percentage of 3, 4, 5% means that hundreds and maybe thousands of athletes in your sport are being harmed with a form of harassment and abuse in sport. Now, I know that these numbers are problematic. First of all, there's lots of different experiences behind those numbers. These are stories of people. These are not just numbers, sorry. These experiences are highly personal. And us, as researchers, we try to come up with a number to classify whether or not that person is harassed and abused. That is very limited. Numbers can never represent the full reality of what somebody was going through. So, of course, it's just an estimated guess, and we see a big variety between people that experience just one incident, for example, of body shaming, or another type of non-contact verbal intimidation, while others really experienced long, repetitive forms of physical and/or sexual and/or psychological abuse. They're all grouped in the same statistics, but we need to understand there's a big variety in the frequency, the duration, and of course also the impact of what they experience. We need to come up with better tools to standardize more, and hopefully our tools in the future will also be better, give you a better idea of what exactly the differences are between athletes with mild experiences, with more moderate experience, and athletes with the most severe experiences, that we're better able to tell you as policymakers and federation employees to do a better job in targeted prevention. What I can conclude on the basis of this study is that harassment and abuse occurs everywhere, in every continent, in all disciplines of all sports, at all levels, both from persons in authority, so authority figures, as well as from peer-to-peer. We should not forget that athletes also commit harassment and abuse to other athletes. It happens from males to males, from males to females, from people with a gender-diverse identity to other people with another gender identity or sexual orientation. So it happens between all genders and by all genders. Most people that suffer harassment and abuse in sport do not disclose. And if they disclose, they prefer not to do it in the sport organization. And you all know why, I think, because of the consequences, because of the fear or the lack of trust. So we need to remember that what you get in your organization as an official report is just a minority of everything that is going on. So you need to be aware that lots of things are going on without anybody telling you about it. Why does harassment and abuse occur in sport? Well, as simple that it just happens everywhere in society. There's not one sector in society that is free from harassment and abuse. In sport specifically, we see a couple of risk factors that might increase the risk of certain types of harassment and abuse. For example, many athletes do not know what harassment and abuse is, what boundaries are, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. If you don't know that, of course, you cannot recognize or detect something that is not appropriate. In all of these studies that we're just talking about, we have to say that in the countries that we studied, in many cases there were no strong safeguarding measures in place. As you say, in the FIG, but also elsewhere, this is new. We're just establishing this. If there is no reporting mechanism or no strong policy, of course, harassment and abuse can grow and cannot be stopped effectively. In many organizations, there was a lack of moral leadership. And if the highest members of your organization do not speak up against harassment and abuse, of course it will be much higher for the people in the organization to take this seriously. And then there's just sport about touching each other in your sport very important to protect each other's safety while doing all of these difficult movements and growing in the sport. There's the changing rooms, there's the locker rooms, there's travel, there's maybe hotel overnight stays, there's commuting from one place to another. These are all practical opportunities. This is not abuse, but it creates the opportunity for abuse. If you then also have a coach that is the brother of the president of the club and actually the physio that is also the cab driver to bring you to your daily practice, it becomes very confusing for the athletes who is doing what and whose role is it. And if I tell somebody about that other person, but they actually are also connected in some other way, it's confusing. And we have to face this. In lots of small sport organizations, this is how it goes. The volunteers, the connection, the close community, and this just increases the risk for abuse to happen and to continue. This is a slide where I don't want to spend much attention on because you know this. Abuse impacts the athlete. It's not about being right or wrong, it's about their own experience. If an athlete experiences something as harmful, it means that it is affecting their life. Maybe their sports performance, maybe their social life, maybe their physical or psychological health. So this is a sign for us to take it seriously and do something with these experiences. It could go very far, from economic loss, loss in the quality of life, to even premature death because of suicidal behavior. So we should take this very seriously. And that is why I'm so happy that you are with so many people here represented today. Very important is to zoom out. While it often happens between one or two persons or a group of persons against one athlete or one person against a group of athletes, it's not just that. We should not look for bad apples in your sport, remove them and think that the case is closed. This is something that happens in your organization between people at interpersonal level, but actually also at organizational level. Do we have the right policies to protect our gymnasts from harassment and abuse? Do we know how to include athletes and parents in decision-making in our organization? Do we have safe infrastructure? These kind of things can also have an impact, of course, on harassment and abuse. But it's more like that. It's not only in your club, it's also in your national federation. And it's what they learn, the kids at school, if it comes to, for example, sexual education and how to treat their phones in a healthy way. So there's a responsibility for the whole community, and let's just say for all of society. International politics at FIG, what we do with UNICEF work, what politicians decide on legal age of consent. So this is all interconnected, and you cannot look at the problem of harassment and abuse as just something between two people that don't get along. It is more important to zoom out and look at responsibilities. I think this is a complicated slide with way too complicated words, but I can recommend you to read the article. I'll send it to you after this symposium, because these researchers give a very interesting overview of exactly those organizational factors that influence the existence of harassment and abuse in sport. And they will sound familiar to you. For example, the power imbalances, very clear in sport. The winner takes it all attitudes. Isolation of certain people in certain situations, living in residential training centers or elite schools, far away from parents and peers that are not in elite sport. Conformity to dominant values, no pain, no gain, you have to try harder. If you can't do this, you're weak or you're not strong. Or even the instrumental effect. Many people still believe that athletes need to go through a certain phase or range of pain and dominance in order to achieve the highest goal. And where is that boundary? Is it pushing the boundary, or is it just really transgressing the boundary? And how do we fight those dominant values that are not always healthy? Organizational tolerance, we talked about that. Role ambiguity as well. And there's many other organizational stressors that really make it very hard to start this safeguarding journey and to make sure it is successful. Now, what is exactly safeguarding? Again, a difficult word. I don't know how to translate it in my language, and probably that's the same problem for you unless you're an English native. Now, what we say at the IOC is that safeguarding is the combination of both the actions you take to prevent harassment and abuse, as well as to respond to cases or concerns of harassment and abuse. There's actually three components. There's the prevention by minimizing the risk. There's the promotion of an holistic welfare policy in your organization, and then there's, of course, in case it's necessary, hopefully not too often, the response mechanisms you have in place. So as you can see here, we're slowly shifting the dialogue from responding to high-profile cases, because that's what we had to do in the first years when we were tackling this issue, to preventing the risks, lowering the risks, and even better, promoting this safeguarding strategy in which we put athletes' welfare first, and doing much more than just prevention of incidents, but really make sure they feel healthy and happy, and you sustainably support them in their sport experiences. FIG is not the only organization at international level that is being confronted with a lot of cases. There's many, including the IOC, of course, as leader of the Olympic movement. And the leadership is now so convinced that this is a priority that they put it in the Olympic Agenda 2020+5 to strengthen safe sport and to protect athletes from harassment and abuse. There's two big roles for the IOC. First of all, as leader of the Olympic Games, they have to do their own job. They are organizing safe events, so they should make sure that safeguarding there is at the forefront of safeguarding everywhere. Olympic Games and Youth Olympic Games should be safe and fair to everybody. And secondly, as a leader of the Olympic movement, IOC is there to help international federations and the NOCs. So we are working very hard to make sure that everybody who needs help on this topic gets help via the IOC Safe Sport Unit. Because indeed, there's quite a lot of work. As you already said this morning, it's not a one overnight job and it gets done easily. Actually, you should see it as a Swiss cheese. We're from Lausanne, so we like the Swiss cheese metaphor. Indeed, in every layer of the Swiss cheese, there are some holes. So if you just put one layer of protection in your organization, there will still be holes. And still risks will be there, and maybe incidents will happen. So it's a case of trying to combine as many layers as possible, both in the reactive response side as well as in the prevention side. Having a strong safeguarding policy and a strategy, it always starts with that, of course, to give direction to what you're doing. Thinking about risk assessment in your specific organization or during your specific event, but also what about safe recruitment? Who is being hired here to work with our athletes? Making sure you do education not only for the athletes, but for all partners. Think about parents. What I haven't heard here today is the role of paramedical and medical staff. We should also make sure they know what to do in case of a concern and know how to prevent it. And of course, the coaches, having codes of conduct for all relevant partners in your organization. You could also invest in mandatory reporting or whatever is legal in your context and in your country. Trained safeguarding officer, of course, during events, but also as an organizational, operational safeguarding officer in your organization. Make sure that there is a way to report in case it is necessary. Make sure that if there is a report, you can also give it the consequence that it deserves, sending it to the criminal system, and or make sure there is a fair disciplinary proceeding. Last but not least, everybody is affected by this. Both the people that report harassment and abuse as those that are accused of harassment and abuse. If possible, provide them with the well-being support they will really going to need, or make sure you partner with organizations outside sport, victim counseling, or any kind of health services to make sure they also are supported. Because as you all know, this is not something easy to work with. And if you're affected by this, there's a huge risk to affect your health. Still, there will be people or mice eating the cheese. So make sure that you use a couple of these layers to make sure that the risk is as low as possible. Now, I'm here today because I'm the data person, and this is my personal slogan, of course: what gets measured, gets managed. So don't do anything without keeping track of what you're doing, and try to monitor and collect data of the changes you would like to see in your organization. And that's exactly what we did at the IOC. Last year, we did a big needs assessment with all Olympic, so that's 39 for the moment, winter and summer Olympic federations. We asked them, we sent them a long questionnaire. They all loved to participate in this survey with a 100% response rate, because that's what you do when you work with the IOC. You just say yes, and then they fill in the survey. And then you can see that the international federations made a very, very big shift. Almost all of them now have a safeguarding policy. Most of them have it implemented. A couple of them are still in development and are ready to implement it. So in a couple of months, they will be ready with their implementation. That is fantastic news. 2 years ago, that picture would have been very different. So everybody is now embarking on this safe sport journey at the IF level. At the NOC level, I just wanted to add that for you working in national federations, it's going a bit slower. We see a slower uptake. About 1 in 4, 1 in 5 NOCs has a safeguarding policy, sometimes only working during the games when they are responsible for the delegation. Some see it a little bit bigger in case of, for example, that they also have training camps in their responsibility. The others are still working on it or did not even start yet. So we should be mindful there is some more work to do. Now, it's not all good news, because we see, indeed, similar as to research, that the global south is not well covered in policies, looking at the NOC level, and that even within Europe, we see fewer attention and fewer strong safeguarding policies in eastern region of our continent. So that is something to be very careful about. Reporting. Like FIG, it's important to have a reporting mechanism in place, and as you see, most of the IFs know that this is important. They have it, sometimes only available during their events, but for most IF now also available outside the course of their events. So all year long you can contact them. Don't only work on response, because it's indeed the biggest change we can make in prevention and education. And I'm very happy to see that indeed IFs are also waking up on that issue, and that many of them are now providing education online or during events to athletes and or parents and or coaches and or their national federation. We see a mixed view there. This is also something I wanted to share with you. I think what FIG is doing with the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation is fantastic. They decided to work with a partner to make sure that cases are dealt with in case there is a problem at national level that can be dealt with. Because as you can see, most of the international federations are struggling to deal with cases. They don't have the capacity. They don't know how to deal with a case that often takes place at a national level, far away from their headquarters in Zurich or wherever they have their headquarters. It's hard to deal with national cases. Lack of money, lack of resource, struggle in jurisdiction, who is responsible here and who is not. So many of them are struggling. So I encourage you to further explore and invest in that relationship with the Gymnastics Ethics Foundation, because if this is what works for you, it really make the effort to make sure that works, and that if there's an increased number of cases, their capacity also increases. Okay, what I want to get to is this. What are the challenges? Because we see a big improvement here, but it's not perfect just yet. Not here and not in any other sports federation. Athletes struggle. They still lack understanding and knowledge of what it is and where to go if they have a concern. Often they also normalize themselves what violent behavior is, and they think they should cope with it instead of just having a safe and comfortable feeling that they could say no to some behaviors. Sometimes, often actually, they feel shame and guilt and fear, or they do not trust the reporting mechanism. They do not know what will happen if they tell their story and how negative it will be for them. They also feel there's sometimes conflict of interest, because that person they want to make a complaint about also decides on important aspects in their sport career or in their whole life. And there's too much power in one central person, so it's too risky to complain about something. Often they feel that there will be a lack of punishment, so they don't want to go further. Or, and that's very important to know, many gymnasts do not want a certain punishment. They want the behavior to stop, and they want to continue in a healthy and safe environment to focus on their dreams in sport. They don't want any kind of punishment, and that's why they don't want to complain. So we should also listen very careful to that. Sport organizations, like you on the other side, sometimes don't have the money to do this properly. Sometimes they lack competency or the skills that you need, because indeed it's a combination of psychological, emotional, judicial skills that many federations just don't have because they're not experts in this topic. As I said, they sometimes struggle with the jurisdiction. If something happens between members of two different national federations and it happens at an international event, and who is then, is it the local organizing committee, or is it the FIG, or is it then the two national delegations that are responsible? That's sometimes a bit tricky, of course, and we need to be very careful in the steps that we take there. And often they find themselves just having to do more than they can and more that is in their remit. And that is, of course, something we should be very careful and concerned about. Many sport organizations do not put the victim in the first place because they have other priorities in their organization. It could be very harmful to a person that makes a complaint. Or they can refer to national services, but if they then work with national safeguarding structures, they're too limited or just non-existing. So from the international level, you want to provide help close to the person that is affected, but the help is not available in that specific country. These are all difficulties, and mostly this comes down with a clash in expectation. The victim or the person affected is calling you, is finally ready to report, and you're not able to help them because they have much higher expectations as what you can offer. And often those criminal or judicial or disciplinary procedures take long. They're very harmful. They don't give you the result they want, so in the end there's no winners. So this is a very, very hard job for the federations to deal with. What is necessary here? What if we start all of these policies, we have these challenges, how can we better improve? Well, I think this is something we should be very mindful of. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats policy for breakfast. Culture eats your safeguarding policy for breakfast. You can have all the nice safeguarding policies in the world, as long as the culture in your clubs, in your federation, in your sport association is not changing, nothing will change. No paper will change that. A paper doesn't protect a child. It's the culture, indeed, that needs to be shifted in your organization. And I think that's the biggest win we still have to make. Indeed, shifting that conversation. I heard it in the opening speeches, I think 2 or 3 times, that you are working on shifting the climate, and that it's not easy, that it takes everybody to be involved, but that you are now on this journey. And that's exactly what it is. Don't look at the top of the pyramid. Don't look at the high performance only. Look at what that individual person needs for proper development. Are their physiological needs met? Can we make sure that as young as 12 years old, staying in a residential elite school far away from parents, that those children have everything they need for a proper, healthy personal development? Do they feel safe? Do they feel comfort? Do they like where they are? Do they have a sense of belonging to their group of athletes, but maybe also to friends in school, outside sport, and with their parents and with their siblings? Do they have a feel of esteem in sport, but also outside sport? So actually shifting the conversation from just surviving to really thriving. Make sure they can grow and they can flourish as a person first and then as an athlete second. I'm pretty convinced that that will give you better and more sustainable results. As Sheldon Kennedy said, a famous ice hockey player that reported sexual abuse by his coach already in 1996, policies just collect dust on the shelf. We don't use them. It's only when you put them into practice and there is moral leadership in your organization that things will change for good. I read the scientific literature for you, and this is what athletes say that could change in the way forward. So please use their voice when you come up with your strategy. Promote holistic athlete development. We talked about that. Improve strength and strengthen accountability measures. Make sure that if you do something wrong, you also get punished for that it feels fair. Implement a body where they can go to. I think that's a check for the FIG. Increase the attention for equity, diversity, and inclusion, because this is part of this bigger discussion about promoting holistic welfare instead of just preventing risk. Make sure sexual relationships between athletes and those in power are not allowed. This is what the athletes specifically ask. Adopt a broader perspective of harm and perpetrators. Use the athlete voice and specifically those of equity-deserving subgroups in the athletes. The red one is a personal addition of mine. I did not find that in the literature yet, but I think we should be more careful with including the coach's voice. And I was so happy and relieved to see that it's on your program today, because we have left them out of this discussion for too long. They were the monsters, the possible perpetrators, the biggest danger to athletes. That's what we thought, that's what the media covered, but that's not true. The main perpetrators are the athletes themselves, amongst themselves, if you look at absolute numbers. So include them in the conversation, include them in what healthy coaching is for them and how to build strong but safe coach-athlete relationships. They can tell you much more because we don't know. They know best. So please include them in your discussion. I just want to finish up with a checklist. That's what I also make for myself if my head is too full with information. So first of all, you're here, you are showing moral leadership. So please continue with that. Take inspiration from each other. There's so many good tools available. I'll give you a slide with all of the IOC tools you can use, but FIG has tools as well, and they're tailored for your sport, so maybe they're even better. But learn from each other, because what you're struggling with in your country might be very similar to what another country is also dealing with at the moment. Learn from other gymnastics federations, and why not also learn from other sports organizations that are struggling with the same issues. If you do something in your organization, please communicate. I know a lot of organizations that have an excellent policy, but nobody knows what it is, where to find it. It's not published. They don't have a communication campaign. So be proud of what you do. And as you said, step by step, implement it and communicate about it. Make sure you focus both on prevention and response. Response is necessary, but if I could spend $1 million, I would spend it, almost all of it, in good education and prevention, of course, because that is key in preventing from further harm. Provide well-being to everybody, support to everybody who needs it, and actually my advice is just be kind. It's not about right or wrong if somebody comes to you with a complaint. It's about being heard and being acknowledged for what they think they suffered and what is in their experience the most important thing. Just listen, be human, be kind is already actually the most important step. Lastly, measure what you do. Of course, if you don't have the data, what the situation is now, you will also not see the change if you work very hard for 2 years and you don't collect data then. So please make sure you can spot the longitudinal trends. Learn along the way. We're all here to learn. That's something I really want to reassure you. We are all learning. We're all making mistakes. Gymnastics has been at the focus of attention for very long, maybe for some relevant reasons, but also just by accident, because these cases happen in all sports. Everybody is learning, everybody is making a mistake. Don't feel like you are the only one that is having a hard time here. Be a helpful bystander. That is, I now speak to you from person to person, not as an organization. But we are all people that love sport, that want our athletes to be safe, so make sure you are a helpful bystander. If you see something, if you hear something, if it doesn't feel right in your stomach when you hear a story, don't just look away. You know where to find help. You know what to do. You have the power to change these things. So please take it seriously and do what you can. And please feel reassured you're not alone in this. FIG is here to help you. The Gymnastics Ethics Foundation can provide you with support. And if you feel that's not possible for you at the moment, the IOC Safe Sport Unit is there. We have 2 permanent safeguarding officers that are standby for whenever you need a concern or advice, or whenever you just are looking for a chat about this topic. I hope you have a very successful rest of the tournament, and if there's anything I can help you with, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tine. Just before you go, Tine, actually, we've asked. I'm just putting this here for what comes next. But Tine, we've been asked for all of our speakers if they can give us like a take-home message. I mean, you had many wonderful messages in that presentation. But is there one kind of overarching message that you would like to give out? Because these messages are going to be put together and kind of collated to sum up what's happened today.
Okay, I think I have to say here now something about the data, because I'm a researcher, so make sure you track your data. But even more important than that, I know that for you the data is not the most important thing. You want to see the real change, so make sure you are part of that and take that moral leadership, because you have listened to the voices that had to share it, but you now also have the power to change it. So please take that role. You're doing a really good job. Continue.
Fantastic. I'm afraid that we don't have time for a Q&A session with Tine, but Tine Vertommen, another round of applause. It was fantastic.